It starts? Okay. Hi, Jeanne. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm
Hi.
terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so we are here at along with Art Gallery in Bronx. So this is the exhibition. The title is Self-Reflection. Self-reflection, rehearse, practicing uncertainty. So you are one of the great artists here, and then today I'd like to ask you about your work. But before that, would you tell me who you are? So yeah.
So, yes, before we get specific, I'm Jeanne Brasile. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for
okay.
including me. And I'm an artist based in New Jersey. And my work is primarily mixed media, but I have a real love of paper, particularly repurposed paper. So, things like what you see behind me. Anything that is old and outmoded and used to be a transmitter of information, but is now an obsolete kind of, I don't want to use the word technology, but a lot of the things I work with are old analog papers that contained information. And in the present day, a lot of this information has been digitized.
Yeah, that's right. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, and then you like to use some text or words since you were a child, is that right?
Yes. So I've always loved language, even as a young child, and I spent most of my life in libraries reading. That was a lifesaver for me. And I also happen to work in an art gallery that is inside of a library. So libraries have been part of my life for a very long time. And in, I think around 2010, a lot of libraries got rid of their analog library card systems, those little 3x5 cards, and then you'd have to go through big oak drawers and pull out the card and find information and then find out where the book was.
Yeah.
So around 2010, both the gallery at Seton Hall University, the library at Seton Hall University where I work, and the Brooklyn Museum Library both upgraded their systems to fully digital, and they got rid of the old analog library cards. And I knew there was something there for me as an artist, and so I grabbed all the available cards that I could. The Brooklyn Museum Library actually posted something on their website that they were getting rid of cards, and I said, oh no. I said, I'm coming, give me as many boxes as you can fit in my car. And so I think they fit like 10 boxes in my old Ford Taurus.
That's great.
And I drove home, and then I didn't know what to do with these cards for a very long time. They seemed precious because they were limited in, they were finite, they were going away. So I sat on these cards for a number of years, and then about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I read an article in the Smithsonian about a librarian named Dorothy Porter. And Dorothy Porter was a librarian at Howard University in the first half of the 20th century. And although the cards I have right now are from the Library of Congress catalog system, she was working with the Dewey Decimal System at Howard University. But one of the things that she did that was very radical was, well, for one, let me just back up. She was an African-American librarian. So she noticed that a lot of Black authors and Black subjects were lumped together in the Dewey Decimal System and in the same place in the stacks. And other authors of other ethnicities and racial backgrounds were just like dispersed with what the subject was that they were writing about. So in an act of what's the word I'm looking for? Defiance. She took the cataloging system and deconstructed it and began putting Black authors with their subjects so that they were integrated. So if a doctor had written a paper, he would be with the doctors now. And I thought, there's something here for me. There's information I can play with. And I started looking at the library cards I had and realized that for a seemingly neutral taxonomical system, there's actually a lot of isms encoded in these cards. Racism, all sorts of other isms. In a pejorative way. And I wanted to play with that information once I discovered it. So I began doing things like shredding the library cards and looking at like the information that remained. And I started seeing words I didn't like primitive or so magical. So I created this one piece, Ethiopian magical scrolls. I noticed that when referring to other cultures that were not the predominant like European culture, that words like magical or primitive would appear, and other sorts of words that were really subjective. And then I thought, well, why don't I maybe redact the cards? And that's when I began crossing out information to draw attention to some of these judgments. Like,
I like this part is,
we the Americans.
The Americans.
So I think about these things because I'm third generation American, and I think about the difficulties that my grandfather had when he came here. He was a young man. He was preteen. He came over on a boat, and they didn't have a lot of money. He came over in steerage, and from what I understand, he didn't have money for food. And he was kind of like begging for food on the boat. So when he arrived here, he didn't have much. And three generations later, I'm pretty lucky. My family owns businesses, and I have a professional degree. So he went through a very difficult time on my behalf. But what I noticed is 3 generations later, some people forget their roots and they lose their empathy.
And you're
for the immigrant experience.
From the Italy, right?
My family is from Italy, but who knows where we're really from, right? I mean,
But it's interesting. Because my great grandpa was somebody came to United States too, but then he was here only 4 years, and he went back to Japan.
But that's funny. My family went back and forth too. My grandfather stayed, but my great grandfather and my great aunt, they went back and forth. And when my family would speak about their experiences, I never understood the timeline. I was like, wait, I thought Aunt Louisa moved back to Italy. Why are you telling me that she owned property here in Brooklyn? So then, as my parents got older, particularly my dad, they started explaining some of the details. But I liked this whole piece was really inspired by this card right here. I found a whole sequence of cards related to the U.S. Census. And so I started thinking about, some of the people the census represented and how they were categorized at the time. And so I began redacting information to leave visible the information I wanted to talk about.
So you have this piece and also this piece. So
it's some of the time I redact information to draw attention to what is there that might be offensive. Other times I redact information that tells information, because there's a lot of kind of gobbledygook. Like there's a lot of like letters that are meaningless to people now, sort of like maybe a text might be to people 100 years in the future, or maybe to people now if you're older or not conversant with texting. So there's all these number systems and letter systems, and sometimes I left those visible because these cards are supposed to convey information, but I actually feel sometimes not only are the cards making a judgment, but sometimes the cards actually obfuscate information. So I use different strategies depending on the piece.
So and then I like this part too.
More census cards and little things like this I want to draw attention to, like heraldry. My family doesn't have a coat of arms. My family doesn't have a background where heraldry would be important. And I noticed in this series of cards, there was a lot of books on heraldry, particularly European heraldry, like coats of arms, family crests, flags. And I was like, why do we have all these books in a library, and who were they talking to, and why were they published? And how many times were these books actually checked out, and by whom? So I started looking at that kind of information when I could match it up with the books, which was not very often, unfortunately. That's another part of an investigation that will take longer, because these books are still in the stacks of the Seton Hall Library in many instances, and maybe I can look at the checkout. I don't know. So that's part of what I was doing. And then these are some of the shredded pieces, and this series is called the Topography of Typology. And after doing work with the cards that were redacted, I started thinking about what are the contours of language. So I started thinking about language almost as a landscape. So I started adding surface. I do a lot of hiking, and I love maps, and so I started thinking about like contour maps and the contours of language and the way we speak about things really populates how we feel about things culturally as well as individually. And I wanted to draw attention to that too. And as you look at all these little shredded library cards, you see different typefaces that were popular throughout time, but you also get glimpses of different words, people, subjects. But there's nothing to really grab onto. It's all kind of shredded up. And, and it's like sort of how language mangles things in a way. It's only an approximation of thought. And, you know, we can go back to people like maybe Robert Morris, who is very conversant with that idea, who's one of my favorite artists. So I'm thinking about library cards, but I'm also thinking about pioneers of modernism like him, who was very aware of language. He was a wonderful writer. And he was very acutely aware that language is sort of a symbolic system. Don't ever confuse it with your actual thoughts. It's just a tool to express thoughts, but how can words really tell? It's sort of like when you're making art, how do you put it into words? It's very difficult.
It's very difficult. Words is, for me, it's, oh no.
Right. So I started thinking the same thing about how really language shapes our thoughts. Sometimes instead of the other way around, our thought shaping language.
So that's why I like that one. I wish I can get some perfect language from here.
This actually, I'm about to make another piece.
Nice.
So this piece is dispensing wisdom, and one of the things I love about it, my dad recently passed. This is his old gumball machine. So, you know, he taught me so many things, but you know, the cards have taught me things, my education has taught me things, and you know, this whole idea of wisdom and then populating it, conflating it with you know, a pop culture-y thing like a gumball machine, you know, sort of you know, it's sort of like knowledge meets pop culture. And I'm sort of making fun of, like, is this wisdom? Is this knowledge? Is this just a representation of something that someone thinks is important? And who is that person that thinks these books are important? You know, who is the person purchasing the books? Who's the person typing up the cards, the cataloger? Each of these people influence these, the publishers of these books. All along the way, there are gatekeepers that are, you know, dispensers of knowledge. But sometimes folk wisdom or family wisdom that comes down through generations is important as well. So, you know, and this actually works. You just have, the next one I'm going to make is going to have capsules, and then you'll be able to get shredded paper in a capsule. Like a little piece of art to take home.
Can we, and one more piece right here. Here, and then, this is mixing.
Mixed messages. Again, so alluding to, I love wordplay, alluding to the fact that don't take information necessarily as a trustworthy source. Be critical in your thinking about it, and you know, always be aware of who wrote that information, for whose consumption, for what purpose. Is it persuasive? Or is it really meant to just convey neutral information? And even when that is the goal, it doesn't always sometimes work that way. So I just really wish to bring all of these little conversations to people's mind, to hope maybe get them thinking about what is a trusted source of information versus, you know, reading into it and drawing your own conclusions.
Okay, thank you so much. So at the end, can you tell me your website and Instagram name too?
So my name is Jeanne Brasile, and my website is jeannebrasile.com, JeanneBrasile.com. And my Instagram handle is @Jeanne Brasile. So, and likewise on Facebook. And you can catch me to a lesser extent on Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you so much. Yay.
Thank you for inviting me.